Learning objectives. After completing this module, learners will be able to enhance knowledge about the sources of Mughal history, understand and elaborate on the agrarian society and its culture in Mughal era, understand and describe the role of women in the agrarian society, understand and describe the relation between forests, tribes and the state, understand and analyze the power of Zamindars and the land revenue system, understand and explain the expansion of trade with the New World, understand the detailed account of Akbar's empire through Akbarnama. Looking for sources. Written chronicles or documents from the Mughal court provide detailed information about the agrarian structure of the 16th and early 17th centuries. Akbar's court historian Abul Fazl chronicled the arrangements made by the state for a good crop, collection of revenue by the state agencies and maintenance of relationship between the state and rural bigwigs. The Zamindars in Ain-e-Akbari, one of the most important sources of agrarian history. Detailed revenue records are also available from Gujarat, Maharashtra and Rajasthan for the 17th and 18th centuries. The records of the East India Company provide comprehensive descriptions of the agrarian relations in eastern India. The source records mention episodes of conflicts between the peasants, zamindars and state, highlighting the peasants' perception and expectations of fairness from the state. Peasants and their lands. A peasant was referred to as a Rayat or Muzarian in the Indo-Persian sources of the Mughal period. We also come across terms like Kisan or Asami. The 17th century sources mention two kinds of peasants, Khud Kashta and Pahi Kashta. The Khud Kashta lived in the village where they owned lands. The Pahi Kashta were cultivators who came from other villages to cultivate lands on contractual basis. To become a Pahi Kashta could either be a choice or a compulsion. An expectation of better revenue in far-off villages would often tempt peasants to move to other villages. In times of famine, they would have no choice. An average North Indian peasant owned a pair of bulls and a plough. Many did own 2 pairs of bulls and 2 ploughs, but owned even less. In Gujarat, peasants owning about 6 acres of land were termed affluent. In Bengal, 5 acres was the outer limit of an average peasant farm. An abundance of crops. Since 2 major seasonal cycles, Kharif and Rabi, were followed in agriculture, most regions grew a minimum of 2 crops annually. 3 crops were also grown in regions receiving adequate rainfall or irrigation facility. The Mughal provinces of Agra produced 39 varieties of crops and Delhi produced 43 over the 2 seasons. 50 varieties of rice alone were grown in Bengal. However, agriculture primarily was focused on basic staples like rice, wheat, pulses and vegetables, etc. Since cash crops like cotton, oilseeds and sugarcane earned more revenue, the Mughal state encouraged their cultivation. In the 17th century, a number of new crops from different parts of the world were introduced in the Indian subcontinent. Maize or Makkah, for example, reached India through Africa and Spain. By the 17th century, it became one of the major crops grown in Western India. At the same time, vegetables like tomatoes, potatoes and chilies and fruits like pineapple and papaya arrived in India from the New World. Caste and the rural milieu. There was no dearth of cultivable land, yet some caste groups were compelled to do menial jobs, pushing them into poverty. A large chunk of the village population having minimal resources belonged to this section. They were bound by their position in the social strata, akin to the Dalits of modern India. In Muslim communities, the meat cutters called halal khoran were stationed outside the village periphery, same way the Mallahzadas or boatmen in Bihar were considered same as slaves. A direct correlation existed between caste, poverty and social status at the lower rung of the society. In Marwar, Rajputs mentioned as peasants share the same status as the Jats who are considered low in status in the caste hierarchy. The Gauravas cultivating land in Uttar Pradesh claimed Rajput status in the 17th century. Castes like Ahirs, Gujars and Malis ascended in hierarchy as they made fortunes out of cattle rearing and horticultures. In the eastern regions, intermediate pastoral and fishing castes like Sandgops and Kevartas attained the status of peasants. Village artisans. Almost 25% of the total rural households were artisans. The distinction between artisans and peasants in a village society was blurred as some people took up both the tasks. Peasants and their families were also involved in craft production activities like dyeing, textile printing, baking and firing of pottery, manufacturing and repairing agricultural implements. The villagers remunerated the village craftspersons like potters, blacksmiths, carpenters or goldsmiths by offering them a share of the harvest or granting a piece of land or cultivable waste for their specialized services. The land grant usually needed the panchayat's approval. In Bengal, the Zamindars usually paid the blacksmiths, carpenters, even goldsmiths a small daily allowance and diet money for their services. At a later stage, it was recognized as the Jajmani system. The term much used in the 16th and 17th centuries is in disuse now. A little republic. Some British officials in the 19th century considered the village as a little republic as the villages comprised of fraternal partners sharing resources and labor collectively. This, however, does not indicate egalitarianism in the rural areas. Individual ownership of assets and deep-seated inequities due to caste and gender distinction existed in the villages. A handful of powerful individuals exploited the weaker sections, dictated terms in the management of the village, and dispensed justice. Beyond settled villages, dense forests covered almost 40% area of the Mughal Empire. The contemporary texts referred to the forest dwellers as jungli, which did not imply absence of civilization. It described people who depended on forest produce, hunting and shifting agriculture for their livelihood. Livelihood-related activities were season-specific. While forest produce was collected in spring, fishing was done in summer. Monsoon months were reserved for cultivation, hunting was carried out in autumn and winter. The state needed elephants for the army. The forest dwellers captured and sold elephants. Supply of elephants was a peshkash levied from the forest dwellers. The Mughal political ideology considered hunt as a symbol of the state's concern for its subject and accord justice to all its subjects, whether rich or poor. During their hunting expedition, the rulers would travel to the remotest territory of their empire and attend to the inhabitants' grievances personally. Commercial agriculture was an important external factor that influenced the lives of the forest dwellers. The demand for forest products like honey, beeswax, and gumlac increased hugely. Gumlac became an important item of overseas export from India in the 17th century. In Assam, the Ahom kings had their pikes. Pikes were people obliged to render military services in lieu of land. Capturing wild elephants was declared to be a royal monopoly by the Ahom kings. The shift from tribal to monarchical system took roots in India much earlier. The Zamindars. Zamindars or landed proprietors enjoyed many social and economic privileges because of their superior status in the rural society. Other than caste, services or khidmat, they rendered to the state elevated their status in the society. The Zamindars owned vast personal lands called milkiyats or property. Zamindars usually hired labor to cultivate the milkiyat lands. They were free to sell or donate these lands. Zamindars were all the more powerful also because the state authorized them to collect revenue on behalf of the state. Control over military resources was also a source of their power. They also maintained fortresses along with armed contingents comprising units of cavalry, artillery and infantry. According to Abul Fazl's account, most of the Zamindars were an upper caste Brahmana or Rajputs. It shows a large representation of Zamindars from the so-called intermediate castes. Muslim Zamindaris were also significant in numbers. Zamindars initiated the colonization of agricultural land and settled cultivators by facilitating means of cultivation and cash loans. The buying and selling of zamindaris paced up the process of monetization in the rural areas. Zamindars sold the produce from their milkiyat lands. Evidences suggest that they used to establish markets where other peasants also came and sold their produce. This fact is substantiated by two observations. Firstly, the Bhakti saints who vociferously criticized caste-based and other forms of oppression never portrayed zamindars as exploiters or oppressors of the peasantry. Secondly, in a number of agrarian uprisings in North India in the 17th century, the peasantry stood by the zamindar against the state. The flow of silver. The Mughal Empire was the largest territorial empire in Asia compared to the Ming, that is China, Safavid, Iran, Ottoman Turkey empires that had consolidated their power and resources in the 16th and 17th centuries. The political stability in all these empires helped develop a flourishing network of overland trade from China to the Mediterranean Sea. India's trade in Europe expanded hugely because of the discoveries through voyages and exposures to the New World America. Expansion of trade resulted in a huge inflow of silver bullion into India to pay for goods purchased from India. It was beneficial to India because India did not have natural resources of silver. Consequently, exceptional stability in availability of metal currencies, especially the silver rupaya in India, was achieved in the 16th and 17th centuries. This helped in unforeseen expansion of minting and circulation of silver coins. Italian traveller Giovanni Carreri passed through India in 1690. His graphic account highlights the way silver transited the globe to reach India. It gives a glimpse of the phenomenal amounts of cash and commodity transactions carried out in the 17th century India. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learned. Written chronicles or documents from the Mughal court provide detailed information about the agrarian structure of the 16th and early 17th centuries. The 17th century sources mention two kinds of peasants, khud kashta and pahi kashta. Expansion of agriculture happened mainly due to three reasons: plenty of land, availability of labor, and mobility of peasants. There was no dearth of cultivable land, yet some caste groups were compelled to do menial jobs, pushing them into poverty. Since village panchayat represented all castes and communities in the village, it was called an oligarchy. Almost 25% of the total rural households were artisans. Women were acknowledged as an important resource in the agrarian society. Women enjoyed the right to property inheritance amongst the landed gentry in Punjab and Bengal. Dense forests covered almost 40% area of the Mughal Empire. The demand for forest products like honey, beeswax and gum lac increased hugely. Revenue from the land was the economic backbone of the Mughal Empire. India's trade with Europe expanded hugely because of the discoveries through voyages and exposure to the New World America. The Ain-e-Akbari was an exhaustive historical administrative project of classification carried out by Abul Fazl under Emperor Akbar's command.